Hello everyone and welcome to the first of two webinars brought to you by the Africa CEO Forum's membership program. Today's topic, Gaslighting Africa, how Africa can raise global expectations of its energy ambitions. My name is Anne-Marie Diaz-Borges and I'm absolutely delighted to be your host today. So our discussion comes in the wake of an ambitious announcement by the World Bank and the African Development Bank to provide 300 million Africans with modern energy by 2030. That's just around the corner. And achieving this goal would, of course, be an enormous success, halving the number of people who are currently without any access to power on the continent. So that's 600 million. But does this mean that Africans can rejoice that energy poverty will soon be history? Because when we think about it, modern access is defined as only 100 kilowatt per year. That's approximately enough to light up a light bulb for an evening, or maybe to charge your phone. That's about just enough. So we're asking here, with 20% of the world's population and rising, but only 4% of the global power generation activity, Africa really faces a very stark energy challenge. And listen to this. By 2030, urban populations in Africa will increase by an additional 350 million people. By 2050, the African population is forecast to rise to 2.4 billion. That's huge. And it will continue to grow, to rise up to over 4 billion, 4.2 billion, in fact, within the next 100 years. That's 4 times about the actual size at the moment. So we're asking here today, can we reverse the trend? Can we make sure that we not only keep the lights on for the people in Africa, but actually give them the power to thrive? In other words, I want to say, can we give them the power in order to empower them? Well, I'm thrilled to be introducing right now our esteemed guests who will be shedding quite a lot of light today on our topic. And 2 of them are here in the studio with me. First of all, there's Daniel Wetzel, Head of Tracking Sustainable Transitions Unit at the International Energy Agency. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you so much.
And welcome also to Guillaume Estager, CEO of Philae Advisory. Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Et bienvenue.
Welcome.
And then joining us all the way from Nairobi in Kenya, we have Jack Kimani, CEO of Climate Action Platform from Africa. That's a not-for-profit focused on impactful and realistic energy solution for Africa. Hello, Jack.
Hello, Anne-Marie. Thank you for having me.
What's the weather like in Kenya?
All is beautiful in Nairobi.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So throughout the session, please feel free, ladies and gentlemen, to send in your questions. We'll be delighted to answer them towards the end of our webinar. But well, let's deep dive into our conversation. And I really want you first to take a look at this. Can you see that? How dark the continent is at night compared to other regions in the world. And it's true, actually, that pictures do speak 1,000 words because we have everything we need to know about the current situation right there. But let me start with you, Guillaume, actually. We've seen the picture. Can you give us an overview of the situation right now in terms of energy access?
Yes, thanks, Anne-Marie. I think it's a very interesting picture here. I think let's try to put things into perspective. I think you mentioned this number, which is really striking. 600 million Africans without access to electricity. Less than half of the African population has access to electricity. I think it's really important we keep that in mind. I think to also put another number, which is really striking, 85% of the world population without access to electricity lives in Africa, 85%. And what I find really interesting is 25 years ago, it was around 40%. So it was an emerging market issue, this access to electricity. And now it's only an African issue. And I think we should really discuss that in further details.
Absolutely, and that's what we're going to try to do today. So can you tell us a little bit about the barriers? What is preventing Africa to catch up in that sense?
Wow, it's it's a tricky question.
Tiny question.
Yeah, it's a tiny. I mean, yeah, well, we have a bit of time to discuss. Huh? I think it's a mixture of factors. The first one is around, I think, the vision. Yeah, the commitment from the government. And I think we will come back. We will come back to that. Linked to that, I think it's about missing regulations and also procurement processes which are not always really transparent, not always really competitive, and I think we need a step change on that. If we then continue looking at the barriers, I think it's about the utilities, the local utilities. Most of them, as we know, are uncreditworthy, close to bankruptcy or even bankrupt, I would say. And I think we will dig into all of that later on, but I think there's, for me, one thing that is also really important to bear in mind is I don't believe financing is so much of the issue. The big issue these days is the lack of bankable projects, and then how we're going to reallocate the capital properly to go into the bankable projects. So financing is not much the issue, is how do we use it and the type of financing that is available. But we will come back to that, I'm sure. Yeah.
That's lovely. You've given us quite a few nuggets, actually, and quite rightly, we'll dive even deeper into those topics later on. And I can see that Daniel is agreeing with quite a few of the points that you said, so I can't wait to hear from you, Daniel. But first, let's go to Jack. So, Jack, you've heard Guillaume mention governments in there, and I want to ask you, so Germany recently began dismantling a wind farm to expand a coal mine, and the UK issued new North Sea gas licenses. So, Jack, do African governments really need to think differently from global north countries to drive energy access?
Yeah, thanks, Anne-Marie. I'll start by saying that to respond to this question, we have to think through which context-specific solutions do work for Africa, especially in the context of the starting point that we are at compared to the global north countries. As Guillaume highlighted, of course, the numbers are very grim. When you talk about nearly 600 million Africans with no energy access, we do have another 150 million that do not even have any reliable access. So in addition to the 600, you're talking of almost 750 million people without access that could be relied on. And then there's 1 billion Africans that do not even have access to clean cooking. So I will acknowledge that from the outset, that the human and the developmental cost of high energy poverty does lead to a strong focus of creating energy access as a first priority for many governments and development partners. But the irony, though, is that Africa, as a continent, also has the world's biggest untapped renewable energy potential, both in absolute and relative terms. And just to give you a perspective on that, Africa's renewable energy potential, and I think Daniel can come back later to confirm this, the renewable energy potential within the continent is 50 times the global anticipated electricity demand in 2040. 50 times. And that's a massive number. And by some estimates, the global electricity demand is expected to double in the next 20 years. So from this, it's very clear that this is not a supply-related challenge. The question that we need to be answering is, where is the offtake? I think Guillaume already highlighted in terms of where is the bankable anchor demand? And without the anchor demand, then it becomes a challenge for African governments to be able to achieve universal energy access. It's important to note that globally, not just within Africa, universal energy access tends to be achieved through cross subsidies. And these work out differently in different settings. So just to give you one example, there's an approach that entails funding the grid expansion to serve more remote customers through profits that are generated from serving urban and industrial demand. So what I'm saying is that energy poor consumers in many African countries do represent a real need for energy. period. No discussion about that. They, however, do not represent a bankable demand. They're both insufficiently aggregated and often are not able to defend, to afford rather, the fully loaded cost of their energy. Guillermo mentioned about the utilities within the continent. And there's a reason why those utilities tend to face challenging financial dynamics, because the tariffs are often set below the cost of production due to lack of bankable demand. That bankable demand, which would enable and does enable the global north countries to cross-subsidize remote connections and access. So it's evident that the existing models are insufficient in terms of being able to drive energy access, because they do not recognize that the renewable energy supply and the industrial processes which act as demand loads need to be developed simultaneously. And let me just repeat that. The renewable energy supply and the industrial processes that will act as demand loads do need to be developed simultaneously. And by so doing, you help in not only driving down the energy costs, but also in increasing energy access. And this is how we need to think differently on the continent.
Thank you very much, Jack. I'm going to you, Daniel. I could see that you were, nodding your head. What can you share with us on the back of what Guillaume and Jack have shared?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I echo many of the comments and sort of the need for further action, and also some of the challenges we've laid out here. One thing, just to set this into context, one, we're seeing a great moment of inertia politically right now on trying to address this issue, and broader access issues, including clean cooking access, which is another big issue in which 80% of Africans, 4 in 5 families, have to cook with wood, charcoal, etc. So thinking about this as a bundle, we see the new World Bank and African Development Bank announcement. We see the new G7 initiative, where access in Africa was placed at the leaders level communique, very front and center. So we're seeing a lot of political momentum, but there are a lot of headwinds that need to face. So if we're looking at the data, and the IEA is really a data-driven organization, we see that investment in energy in Africa hit its peak in 2014 and has been falling since. Now, why that's falling has been a pulling back of investment in export-oriented fossil fuel projects. And what you've seen is those that are based on domestic demand, going back to this bankability issue, of those, the number of those projects have pretty much flatlined and stayed consistent, with some small growth in clean energy investment, but largely is flatlined while we see export-oriented projects for fossil fuels falling. So right now we're needing to see that change and that shift in focus on how do we find the solutions to be able to make investments needed on domestic demand, and how do we make sure we meet those. So this is challenge number one, and this is made much more complicated with the debt crisis utilities and governments are facing, as well as also the high interest rates globally that are putting higher expectations on returns, particularly in markets that are perceived by the investment community to be riskier. So this is issue one. When we look and double click on the issue of electricity access specifically, we've actually seen that since 2014, we've turned that ship around. The number of people without access to electricity was continuing to climb until 2014, where a big focus on this had shifted it, and we were starting to see progress being made. But because of COVID and the energy crisis globally, this has moved up prices. This has put a huge strain on utilities, and we're actually seeing that the number of people without access is continuing to rise again starting in 2000. Our initial data sees that 2023 is going to be a pivot where we're seeing progress again being made. And one of the big innovations here is solar and batteries. So getting into this notion that clean tech is becoming much, much, much cheaper, with thanks to a huge ramp up in manufacturing capacity, and also the great resources that Africa has. So we look at last year, historically 90% of people gaining access did so from a grid connection. Now we see actually 50% of them are using off-grid systems to be able to do this. So there are many promising signs around, but as I said, the headwinds continue to be big, and some of them are going to rely on the international community and development finance to help close that gap and reduce some of these risk perceptions, as well as other activities to improve the bankability of projects. So.
So it's really a multi-stakeholders kind of venture, isn't it, with governments and agencies, and the private sector will hopefully dig into that later on. But on the back of what you said, and I do want us to talk about clean cooking in a few minutes as well. But on the back of what you just shared, Daniel, so according to the IEA, actually, although Africa accounts for 1/5 of the global population, while the region currently attracts only about 3% of global energy investments, which you've tapped into. And by 2030, energy investment needs to double to over $200 billion per year. That's enormous, and that in order for Africa to really achieve its goals. So I'm going to go back to you, Guillaume, and I just want to ask you very directly, is there a financing shortage? I mean, I do understand from what Daniel said that it's more complex than that, but the question is quite direct. What is your thought?
No, I don't believe there's really a financing shortage. I think again, I think we all agree that there's a lack of bankable projects, and we will come back to that because that's a key topic as well. But I think what I see advising, public companies and private companies, in developing and financing this capital-intensive, projects, is that the risk reward of this project is deteriorating over the years. And I think that's really one of the key issues, and why private capital is really struggling to be channeled towards all these projects. And I think when you think about that, this risk reward, which is a key concept, a key element here, I think the issue is how we're going to redirect this capital, not so much with increasing the liquidity, but much more in providing risk mitigation instruments. And I think that's where, the development financial institutions, especially, the bilateral ones and the multilateral ones, have a key role to play on really mitigating this key risk rather than, bringing additional financing. The issue right now for the private equity funds, for all the banks, is how do you deploy the capital to this bankable project?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm going back to you because I can see, again, I'm looking very closely at what you're doing. You're taking some notes. What can you share about this, especially according to you, what needs to be changed in terms of what's holding up greater investment in this department in Africa, according to you, according to the data that the IEA collects?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this notion of risk perception, how do we make sure that the instruments we have today, that the World Bank, African Development Bank, other multilateral institutions have, can really help de-risk the portions of the project that are sort of the most concerning to private sector investors, and bringing them in to play there. Because there's a new philosophy in development finance. It's been around for a while, but there's a lot more focus on it. Is instead of saying, I'm going to finance this project that's infrastructure oriented and I'll finance all of it, instead I provide a guarantee, I provide some first loss capital, and then the private sector says, great, now this looks like a risk reward profile that I can deal with, that I can sell to my investors. And this, I think, is the pivot in terms of how people are thinking about doing things differently. Now, going back, I think, to this notion on what are the bankable things, and I think the point that was brought up on renewable projects have to come with the reliable offtake is crucial. And there's a few places where this is very viable today. We think about the number of people using diesel gensets for backup power. They clearly have an ability to pay for that, an ability to afford that. This should be a great target. Other ones would be people using irrigation pumps and being able to make sure that, change those over to solar. But also I think there's a lot of discussions diplomatically on we need to diversify our global clean energy supply chains. There's a lot of critical minerals in Africa. DRC is a huge producer of cobalt. Yes. There's a bunch of other places. These could be strong anchors that are proven bankable demand that is predicated on international offtake that's very attractive to investors. And I think this is a great way to bring African countries into this conversation on, being a part of the solution. I think this is something that President Ruto, other leaders in Africa have been very vocal on, to say, we want to be a part of this. Absolutely. How do we have battery factories, assembly factories, and this can really help the equation on the demand side.
That's very interesting, actually, that you mentioned the supply chain, isn't it? And COVID has shown the fragility of the energy supply chain in Africa. So resilience is definitely something that we need to look for. Guillaume, did you want it to react?
No, indeed. I think we're fully on agreement here. I think going forward, there's a need to change a bit the mandate of the development financial institutions in order to allow them to take more risk, to position themselves much more on risk mitigation instruments, and also make sure that they don't crowd out the private sector. I mean, these institutions should be here to attract more private capital because let's also be very clear, this revolution we are all talking about access to electricity will only possible if the private sector is part of that. And the key question is, how do we attract more private capital into this all needed revolution?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And we'll come back actually to this private public sector, because at the moment, really in most African countries, energy is supplied by the public sector, and that's one of the issues. But I want to go to you, Jack. On the back of what you've heard, what according to you would be the necessary conditions, enabling conditions to support investments in energy supply?
Yeah, I want to pick up from just the last comment that Guillaume made in terms of how then we attract the kind of investments from the private sector, how we make it feasible for them to deploy their capital, and the conditions that are necessary, obviously, to attract that. So just going back to the conversation at the beginning in terms of, if we agree that we do need this bankable demand, if we agree that industrial anchor demand is a necessary ingredient in terms of being able to have the additional renewable energy generation, and using that additional renewable energy generation to then catalyze universal energy access and to help solve for energy poverty, then I will narrow the focus to three things. And the first one is, we do need to spend some time and analyze and generate the evidence to close the data gaps that are needed to allow that we can be able to surface African countries as potential cost competitive locations for many parts of the solution to the global climate challenge. So we have to think about, where does Africa provide a competitive edge for deployment of the solutions that we're discussing, from a decarbonization standpoint, from getting us to net zero. And I should add to that many of these solutions do offer viable long-term investment returns, and so should be able to attract capital that seeks a return. But we do need to generate the evidence behind them. And so a lot of the work that we do at CAP-A is looking at what are those viable options in being able to drive the kind of investments that we know are needed within the continent. Now, I will add, in addition to the conversation around capital availability, access to global markets. If we do not have access to global markets, if we don't have fair and equitable access for the kind of low emissions products made in Africa, then these would negate the kind of advantages and the kind of opportunities that Africa can be able to bring to the table. So we have to look at trade rules. And what's typically the case today is that most capital owners, or I should say global north, they'll normally give with one hand through, for instance, increased donor funding, while taking much more with the other through unfair trade rules. So we have to think about how African cost competitive solutions can truly be able to contribute to global solutions. And to be able to do that, there is a need for access to buyer markets. And as new instruments and mechanisms like CBAM do get introduced in different jurisdictions around the world, obviously CBAM in Europe, there's a need that those mechanisms be designed in such a way that African providers are not implicitly or even explicitly excluded or disadvantaged. And lastly, I'll just say that from a risk mitigation standpoint, obviously some of the tools available, and I think Daniel mentioned, for instance, the first loss capital. We do also need currency hedges and those kind of tools to help unlock more capital. But this is also likely to link to elements of national policy and regulation. And so countries themselves within the continent, obviously, there is a need for being able to have the kind of policy environment that will signal to investors to come in and allow that we can be able to attract the kind of investments that are needed. Perhaps later on we can talk about, when we talk about the cost of capital and de-risking and so forth, we can think about some of the things that are obviously yes, relevant and that are true in terms of de-risking within the continent. But I think there is also the need to debunk some ideas, some risks that are not as relevant, and especially given certain business models. And so allowing that investors can be able to assess this in a way that is informed, in a way that is true, in a way that is truly reflective of the situation within the continent.
Thank you, Jack. So debunking the risks. Daniel, what are your thoughts?
No, I think it's an excellent point. So we've done our team has done a lot of research on this topic and analysis based on the data there. So maybe one thing to start off with is, for the same solar project that you would build in Europe, the US, China, other emerging market and developing economies have to pay 2 to 3 times more on average for the capital, the loans they take out, et cetera, to finance these projects. Some of those are inherent risks to those markets. Some of those are perception risks. And that there are steps that people can take, both in terms of policies. Guillaume had mentioned before, having the right regulations in place that give investors the clarity that they need. The other portion is data, as Jack pointed out, that the right data to be able to say, how have deals been done in the past? How much was the private sector participation? What were the right de-risking instruments used? And having more transparency on this can help investors be able to size these deals up and make them more replicable. Because right now, each deal is kind of bespoke right now in Africa. They have to go through that. Everyone's not sure if this is a good deal or not. And having more data that help clarify that can really help move the deal volume much faster. One anecdote to say is that I was talking to an investor once that was saying, if I make a high-risk deal in Southeast Asia, where there are clear benchmarks on how that investment should perform, versus in Africa, where there aren't those clear benchmarks, I get a slap on the hand if that investment goes bad in Southeast Asia. I lose my job in the context of Africa because there aren't those benchmarks there. And so this notion of just building benchmarks, I think, is a very powerful and low-hanging fruit that I think the world should get behind in terms of data provision.
Mm-hmm. Guillaume, you've worked in different regions of the world, including in Asia. What are your thoughts actually on that aspect? How does it compare? Why do countries in Asia, in Latin America, some of them have managed where Africa hasn't? And how can that collaboration between the private and the public sectors can really come to give us real solutions in Africa?
Yeah, indeed. I think there's let's bring another angle into the conversation here to answer your question about what I would call the early stage development of these projects. I think in Africa, less than 10% of the projects that are being developed on the continent do reach financial close. Beyond that, the cost and the risk of developing a project in Africa is significantly higher, and Daniel mentioned that, touched upon that before. And I think it's very important that we try to crack this one. Because that's really critical if we want to attract the private capital, into project development here. And coming back to your point here, there's some work to be done by government upstream in terms of regulation, in terms of providing, some securities in terms of planification as well. So the private sector is clear about what are the key projects and that they will be supported by the government because they do make sense. So I think there's a point, between private companies and governments to work together, upstream. That's one thing. Then also there's another point where, this interface between the public and the private sector should be strengthened here, is on the project development phase in having a proper risk allocation. I think we all know what is a proper risk allocation if we want to develop a project in Africa, but we do reinvent the wheel all the time. And it's costly, it takes time, and it has an impact, as Daniel mentioned, on the cost of capital at the end and the development cost. So technical assistance will be, I think, the second element here, in order to address, this early stage, which is really critical if we want to crack this access to electricity issue.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. Jack, actually, we have a question from the audience, so thank you very much to you who are reacting online. And so our first question is, DFIs no longer finance natural gas projects, even when they are bankable, and we're talking about that aspect of bankability, but should they? Who would like to answer to that question? DFIs no longer finance natural gas projects, even when they are bankable, but should they? Anyone would like to react? Jack, maybe you online?
Sure. I will say this. I think in the context of as the world thinks around, obviously the huge energy demand that needs to be fulfilled, because by some estimates, obviously we'll need to double our generation in the next 20 or so years, and so there's a big sort of investment that needs to happen. So there's a question around which investment should we be focusing on now, and I think Daniel might have mentioned about this. We know that the cost of renewables has been dramatically falling in the last, since 2010. I'm trying to recall the numbers here. I think if you go back to 2010, for instance, the cost of solar has come down by almost 85%. I think the cost of wind generation has dropped by perhaps another 55%. So we are at a point where, at an inflection point, even that, when you talk about opportunities around renewables vis-a-vis opportunities around obviously fossil fuel or fossil fuel driven production opportunities, I think there is a question obviously around it's not just generation right now. We also have to be thinking about the decarbonization of the planet. And I think given Africa's renewable energy potential and the ability for the continent to provide energy access for all Africans by 2030, while reducing total emissions related to energy generation, and by some estimates, even close to about 80%, then there is a consideration in terms of it's not just a purely financial play. There is also living within planetary boundaries and how we need to think about opportunities that present themselves. And I think to the extent that we need to get to the point where we are driving towards where we need to be at, given our net zero targets, then we have to consider where we obviously prioritize in terms of capital allocation and where we can get the biggest bang for the buck.
Thank you, Jack. So getting our priorities right. Daniel, how would you answer that question from...
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Jack already tapped into this, is the economics have changed radically in terms of building, particularly in the electricity sector, power generation projects, and also financing them has changed radically. So based on our analysis, one, as we said before, 60% of the best solar resources globally are in Africa. And when you look at the cost of solar, it is almost the lowest cost source of energy for electricity generation in almost all parts of Africa today. By 2030, with the price declines expected, everywhere it will be the cheapest source of electricity. So I think when we are looking at that, it's the right economic thing to do in the power sector. And based on our analysis for our scenario in Africa that looks at meeting all NDCs and also meeting universal access, we would see by 2030, 80% of new capacity installed would be renewable, largely driven by the financing. Now, conversely, we do see, we have to be realistic here. There are certain end uses that we still need gas For instance, steel production, cement production, desalination. These are some of the areas that we see that natural gas cannot be replaced on an economic basis in the near term. Yes, there's ways to be able to make some of those investments that they can pivot in the future to hydrogen, to other things, but we need to be realistic in that Africa's energy development and also their economic development needs to be put first in terms of a just energy transition.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Actually, I think this is a very, very strong point there, because at the end of the day, development has to happen. And with the population rising in urban areas, you need houses, you need schools, you need infrastructures, you need cement. And that, as you said, needs a certain type of energy. So in view of the pressures put upon Africa to remain as clean as possible, even though it pollutes much less than other regions in the world, I want to ask you, Guillaume, what do you think? Does gas still need to play a part in the energy mix on the continent?
Yeah, I think we are all in agreement here. Gas is a very important factor in the energy mix, for the transition. Let's get the priorities right. It's about cracking the access to electricity, and it's about fostering the industrialization of a continent here. And I think we should stop, this debate about gas against renewable energy. I think the two complement each other. They have different roles to play, and they do support each other. If we want to promote renewable energies, and obviously fully agree with you, Daniel, that the costs are going down, then gas has also a role here because it will provide base load. That is very difficult, as you said, to if you only have renewable energies which are intermittent, and also indeed it will compensate the intermittent solar and wind intermittency here. And also it's a source of power that is much more dispatchable. So the two complement each other. Let's be very clear. We need both, and gas will have to play a key role going forward.
Mm-hmm. Because it does seem like an unfair game at the moment, where we're asking so much from Africa to leapfrog and do all these things that really haven't been done elsewhere, to be honest. Because when we look at Europe or the United States or anywhere else, they use fossil fuel. Daniel, actually, I want to ask you then, in that case, how can Africa really balance its energy needs, but also look at those global climate goals?
Yeah, so as I said, in the power sector, I think the economics are very much in Africa's favor on this. And when we think about the industrial decarbonization piece of this, other countries, this is what we would call the harder to abate sectors in the climate world. Other countries need to be leading on the innovations needed. They need to be doing the pilot projects. They need to be bringing the cost down such that in other countries can follow and on past that. I think there's also a great opportunity to be able to do some of these in partnership with Africa. One area that we're starting to see this in great interest is in terms of hydrogen. And we did the analysis, even though hydrogen is well off and the costs are still quite high, we have to do these pilot projects. And when we look at the economics of a delivered molecule derived from hydrogen to Northern Europe, Africa is competitive as any other key leading market that could be able to supply that. So because of the great renewable potential and some of the aspects there, it'll be very cost competitive vis-a-vis other regions to be able to do that. And I think going back to this bankability component as well, is if you do build that hydrogen project and it's predicated on international demand, it does also help reduce some of the perceived risk if Germany, for instance, is the one that is purchasing that molecule at the end of the day. So there are some synergies here in thinking about how do we do that needed innovation with Africa, I think is a really salient point.
Mm-hmm. And also one of the questions, because we talked about how some projects cost more when it comes to Africa, but tariffs for the consumers also are much higher. They can be up to, an African can pay up to 7 times more on average than someone in China, for instance. So how do those costs trickle down to our consumer on the ground? What do you think?
Maybe I'll jump in here first. The one thing, when we looked at the affordability piece of this, so one, yes, many cases, China has particularly low electricity prices for residential consumers. But when we look at this in Africa, there's a big challenge with managing affordability on molecules, on electricity today. And when we did analysis on this, we saw that 50% of the people who do not have access today, even with the subsidies in place, 50% of them would still not be able to afford a basic set of energy services if provided to them. So when we're thinking about the composition of extending access, we know that affordability support will be key. Now, the best way to design that affordability support is to make it as targeted as possible. Because what you actually see is that your top 10% of energy users, if you're, let's say you're just reducing the price of electricity, your wealthiest households end up consuming about 10 times more than those who have just gained access, right? And so this big disparity is you end up spending all your subsidies on those households who don't need that support. So it's really about how do you target and find the households and reach those households that need that support to make sure they're using the energy that can really improve their lives and help bring them up the development ladder.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So we have a question actually from Ellie in Rwanda. What specific measurable targets should African countries set to significantly improve energy access and generation capacity over the next decade? Great question there from Ellie in Rwanda. So what specific measurable targets should African countries set to specifically improve energy access and generation capacity over the next decade? So looking ahead, who would like to take up this question? Guillaume, I'm saying ooh, but I'm looking at you.
I think what is important here when you look at the energy market is security. Yeah, it's one thing, and here we talked about that, and
Yes.
we all agree that this security reliability is not really there. It needs to be cost effective. Yeah, that's the second point, and I think you mentioned that, Marie, that the tariffs in Africa are really much higher than elsewhere. We can come back to that. And the third element, which is also really important, it needs to be as CO2 neutral as possible. So there's a kind of triangle, that needs to be set around reliability, affordability, and being as CO2 neutral as possible, over the years. So these are the key targets I see going forward that we need to keep in mind.
Yes, it's not just having access, but it's reliable access, isn't it? We've all been there, on the continent, when the power just goes off like
reliable, affordable.
Absolutely,
and,
being very practical. And yes, Jack, let me go back to you. Maybe you would like actually to answer that question. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah. I think what I would want to add to that is I think where we are at today is that when you think about location decisions, when it comes to some of the opportunities around green hydrogen, as Daniel was saying, essentially green industrialization pathways, we need to take into account that we are moving from a world where energy in the form of hydrocarbons, it was easy and cheap to transport that. And now we are moving to a world where renewable energy is not, which then calls for locating energy-hungry industrial processes close to sources of renewable power, because you're able to produce low embedded emission products and allow that you can be able to meet global consumption. So if you think of it that way, the opportunities that this presents for Africa, again, with its abundant renewable energy potential, I think the number that Daniel highlighted was 60% of the global solar, I think 40% of all renewable resources, then you start to see where the opportunity starts to come in terms of being able to achieve energy access. Looking at how these industrial opportunities become an anchor demand that enables you to cross-subsidize energy access for the continent. I just wanted to give a quick example of some work that we've been doing around this, looking at the opportunities around, for instance, bauxite production. Africa has about 25% of the world's bauxite production today, and that is almost exclusively exported and processed. And so if you only shifted that supply chain and allow that you're processing these bauxite in Africa using renewable energy, it can enable that you provide a basis for investment in 44 gigawatts of additional renewable electricity capacity. 44 gigawatts. That essentially moves the current installed capacity by 50%. So this is a kind of ideas when we talk about investing in generation of investable, bankable ideas at a scale that enables the kind of capital flows, at a scale that enables the kind of unlocking of opportunities within the continent. These are the kind of ideas that we're considering and looking at being able to surface and bring to the attention of capital owners.
So talking about unlocking that potential, actually, Jack, I want to ask you, how can the green transition, because we are talking in effect about a green transition, be turned into a springboard for energy access in the continent?
Yeah. A substantial part of the discussion, obviously, in Africa is about the so-called just energy transitions. And this was pioneered by JETP for South Africa. And the key focus in South Africa is on transition indeed, given that South Africa is one of the most emission-intense economies globally, not just in Africa, but globally. But for most of other African countries who have very low footprints, but high energy poverty, as we've been discussing, the challenge is really about growth. And I'll sound like a broken record on this, but growth is the main issue for most of these countries. And growth that is sustainable, growth that is equitable, growth that can generate positive climate results, avoiding the high emission dependency like in most of the global north countries. And as we have been discussing, the good news is that the renewables driven energy pathways are very viable and cost effective today. And so they provide an avenue. And given Africa's, again, renewable energy potential, it provides an avenue that can enable energy access for Africa by 2030, but then also provides a basis for the kind of economic growth that enables the continent to not just grow with a net zero growth trajectory, but can be able to do this with a net negative growth trajectory. And by so doing, being able to shoulder the burden of the rest of the global community in terms of getting to net zero, where it will take some time for other parts of the other countries to be able to get to their net zero targets. And so you're able to buy them time to get to their net zero targets, and by being able to go massively net negative through the opportunities that are available through this green transition. So for most of the African countries, there isn't much of a transition. Yes, the actions within the continent will contribute to the global transition. But within the continent, you're essentially able to go green from the start, because for most of these countries, there's very little in terms of energy infrastructure that you need to decarbonize, that you need to be able to transition from. But by investing in the opportunity, by going green first, going green from the start, then you contribute to obviously that green transition and allow that you're starting to onshore some of the global production. You're starting to onshore some of the manufacturing opportunities within the continent that allow that this transition can be achieved at the same time, enable that you're meeting the development needs within the continent.
Thank you very much. And talking about, all these opportunities, it's actually a little bit sad that we are in 2024 and we are talking about giving access, the most basic access to electricity to the majority of Africans, when in the rest of the world we're talking about AI, we're talking about all these fantastic things going to Mars. But anyways, this is where we are. But at the same time, the continent is just incredibly blessed with so many potential renewable energy sources. Here are some stats for you. So the continent, very, very sunny, almost an infinite potential for renewable energy with 11 terawatts for solar capacity. But at the moment, if I'm not mistaken, we're only tapping into 1% of that. 250 gigawatts for hydropower, and yet only around 6 or 7% is being used at the moment in terms of capacity. We have geothermal, we have wind power, of course. And on the question of of hydroelectricity, we have a question, very, very pertinent question from Antoinette in the Congo. And she's asking, can hydroelectricity be part of the energy mix? And if so, why is it not being so much on the table? Why are we lacking of investments? Maybe to you, Guillaume? Hydroelectricity?
Yeah, I think hydro is definitely on the table, no doubt. I think it's renewable, it does provide base load.
And the Congo is a great place for that, isn't it?
The Congo is obviously a great place, I know very well and I love. But I think basically, just building on all these numbers and figures that you gave us, I think what does it tell us? It tells us that, many of the African countries are, I would say, caught in what I would call the poverty trap. What do I mean here is they are not able to pay for the very high or higher upfront costs that are required, to finance renewable energy projects. And I think hydro is a very, very good example of that. Yeah, very high capex upfront, and then very low OPEX going forward. Mm-hmm. But, in order to be able to enjoy the benefits of that, you need to be able to pay, this upfront investment. And what is going on in many countries actually are trapped into that, and they are locked into higher cost and recurring payment from, fossil fuels. And we need to unlock that, and we can come back to that. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Guillaume. We have another question from Anthony Osijo, and that's a question for you, Daniel. Beyond just talking, how can DFI stop the chat and start deploying? Very straightforward. In other words, how do we make them provide the dev cap necessary faster?
I think this is a very topical question, and one that is top of mind for many of the multilateral development bank finance reform discussions that are going on through different initiatives like the Bridgetown Initiative, the 4P process from here in France. So I think it's essential that we think about using that development capital differently. There are different facets to this. One, I think Guillaume brought this up, how do we give them the mandate to take greater risk? Because right now, some of the stipulations that they have really limit the ability for them to deploy this capital in a way to make it more development-oriented, to engage with the private sector more and bring them in. Maybe an interesting thing to say about this is the EIA has sort of estimated in this sort of scenario by 2030 that we would need to double energy investment that you laid out. Mm-hmm. But underneath that, it would require a tripling of private sector investment, because the way we see going forward is that development finance is being used not to finance those whole projects, but instead bringing in more private sector participation. So this focus on how do we leverage it better, I think, is essential, and also means that those constrained development dollars, there's only so many that governments are going to put forward, those constrained development dollars go further. Now, in terms of the speed portion of that, again, I think this data, the benchmark piece, building up the pipeline of bankable projects with the right technical assistance, these are all parts of the solution here. But I don't think there's one silver bullet to it because, yes, there are certain red tape that we can reduce, but certain elements of that also are the right safeguards to make sure those are successful investments and we're not, just going around in circles in terms of doing a failed project and then being back at square one with more red tape. So I think really making sure we're finding that balance is key.
Thank you. Guillaume, another very straightforward question to you. How do we turbocharge climate finance?
I think we have already touched upon a few of these solutions. You mentioned, Daniel, these risk mitigation instruments. For instance, we talked before about focusing on the early stage part of project development, which is also very important. I think what we see emerging is blended finance vehicle here. What do we mean by blended finance vehicle? We mean blended concessional financing that is typically coming from multi-development lateral banks, blended with private capital within one single vehicle here. just to give you some example here, BlackRock, for instance, developed what they call the Climate Finance Partnership. So they managed to raise nearly $700 million just a couple of years ago with a mixture of public capital, typically what we call first loss, so capital that is able to absorb some key risk that typically the private sector won't be able to absorb, okay? And then in de-risking, this tranche, then they have been able to attract much more private capital that will be otherwise, not able to invest in an African context, So blended finance vehicle is definitely one way to address that, one way to mobilize, much more climate finance, much more financing towards the infrastructure sector.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I want to go back to that clean cooking, Daniel, because we are really talking about what happens on the ground and how we can ease the pain of everyday life for most of the people on the continent. So at the IEA, you had a major summit on the topic, and can you tell us a little bit more about it? Because at the moment, I understand that just under 1 billion people lack access to clean energy just to cook your everyday meal.
Yeah, absolutely. So we at the IEA have been tracking the energy poverty, energy access gap for a really long time. And as I said, we've seen progress many places on electricity access, but oftentimes this access to clean cooking is the forgotten form of energy access.
And it's central to the quality of life, isn't it?
Absolutely. And if anything, it's almost, I think, more closely intertwined with development objectives. So when we think about this, this is people having to go out and gather firewood on a daily basis to be able to cook their meals. This cooking process is much slower, much more inefficient. We see that on average, oftentimes women are spending 5 hours a day gathering firewood and cooking. And when we think about our objectives in terms of making sure more people are able to pursue jobs, be able to pursue education. We heard from the minister of Uganda who was here saying, I am here today because my older sister was the one that had to go out and gather firewood, but I could pursue an education. So this is something that's really affecting gender equality, development, education, and health is really one of the major reasons we should do it. It's the second leading cause of premature death in Africa today is inhalation of of harmful pollutants due to this. So in terms of an agenda, really the IEA, our executive director, took a very strong stance saying this should be the top of our energy development agenda globally, and we keep forgetting about it. So we were really fortunate to have many heads of state there, and also the Prime Minister of Norway, the President of Tanzania, the President of Togo, the President of Sierra Leone, and also we were able to mobilize 2.2 billion in additional financing available, both public sector and private sector sources for this cause. Now, to solve this, we have the solutions. When we look at India, Indonesia, they have basically reduced the number of people without access to clean cooking by 1 billion over the last decade. And so this is roughly the number of people that lack it in Africa today. And we see it's a combination of LPG, electric cooking, improved cook stoves that burn more efficiently, and new things like bioethanol. There's a great company called Cocoa Networks in Kenya that is really trying new innovative solutions with bioethanol as well. So there's a lot of solutions, biopellets, and there's a lot of great companies operating on the ground in Africa today that have their manufacturing there. Another one, Burn Manufacturing, is one that is known to have a few different factories opening up across Africa. So we're seeing momentum, and really it's how do we double the political commitment to the cause, and how do we make sure that more financing and the right support and supporting ecosystem is available there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much actually for reminding us how access to energy is central to everyday tasks, whether it's studying, cooking, eating, reading, you name it, going to the doctors. And it's true that those countries that have industrialized the fastest are the ones who have managed to solve this issue of access to power. Well, we've got quite a few questions coming in. Actually, that's great. So moving back actually to clean cooking, we're staying on this. This has just come through to power generation. So a new question from Betty Wilkinson, who is worried about the timelines, Daniel. How long does the average investment in renewables take from conception to implementation? That's a great question. Is Africa's development on hold in the meantime?
Great question. So the development timeline of different projects is very dependent on the resource and the size of that project in particular. So, something like solar can be much more modular, can be sort of deployed much more quickly. We see this with wind as well, a little bit longer development times, let's say probably in the 2 to 3 year range in advanced economies, maybe a little bit longer in Africa. Then you have these big projects, hydro, nuclear. These ones are taking much, much longer to deploy. So this, I think it's one that is a facet of all electricity and power generation assets. Some can be deployed more quickly than others, with solar and small natural gas generators being some of the quickest, to these longer, large-scale projects. One thing I also think is very important that we've seen in Africa is the grid delays of extending the grids to those power resources and to the people who are going to be using it and the businesses that will be using it. And actually this has been a bottleneck for many different projects, and there's examples, I think, in East Africa where projects are done, ready to get plugged into the grid, and the grid still hasn't reached there yet. So this is another particular aspect of the challenge, and for me, the one that's more concerning and needs to be able to find the right solutions there to be able to advance those projects on a timely basis.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So a question for Jack now. Africa's vast natural non-renewable assets should be recognized, and we should be more business-like about it. Either we are compensated, carbon credits that is, for not extracting them, otherwise we will exploit. So it's tough, but why should the whole world play hardball except Africa?
Yeah, I could not agree more. I think Africa has to look out for its own interest. And I think this is a key point here, where there's opportunities for the continent, obviously, to tap into the opportunities that are emerging because of the transition that is happening. And I think we have to be careful that we do not fall into the same sort of traps. We don't regress into the same kind of, contractual arrangements that obviously did not have the same kind of benefit to the continent. Anne-Marie, I wanted to come back to the question on clean cooking as well as a response, especially the examples that Daniel did highlight of Cocoa Networks, BAN, and others. And I think it ties to the importance of carbon markets being able to function optimally for the continent. So to be clear, the carbon markets are far from perfect, but they do provide the kind of opportunity to enable the shift that we need to see in this context across, clean cooking, across other various climate smart interventions, and just to give an example of Cocoa Networks, the reason why they are able to provide a viable solution from a clean cooking standpoint is because they're able to leverage the carbon markets in a way that they can use the carbon financing as a subsidy, which they're able to extend to their customers. And then it allows that their products and the ethanol that they're using to power their burners can be made affordable. So this is also part of the critical ingredients as we think about the continent in terms of positioning, and those are some of the commercial financing instruments that we need to consider how they can be brought to bear. And I think even in terms of critical minerals, thinking around how do we shift from where Africa is seen sort of just as an extractive source for a lot of these minerals, to where these minerals start actually driving true economic growth within the continent.
Mm-hmm. And I like this notion of being more business-like, isn't it? This is indeed serious business. So there's another question for you, Jack. Privatization of Gencos and Discos has proved inefficient. What other policy tools can be used, and how can we advocate for them?
So obviously this has to be context specific by country, and thinking through, again, how do we develop viable options, viable opportunities for the continent? And when I say viable, is to think through what is it that has the most, has the ability to provide a kind of returns? Returns not just from a business standpoint, but obviously social returns in a way that is most relevant for the context that we operate in. And I think this is part of the interrogation that we do have to go through as a continent as we grapple with the various different options. Now, whatever we do at the end of the day, and this is where, I think a point that Guillaume had highlighted, we have to be thinking about attracting private sector scales of capital. And private sector scales of capital is what will enable the kind of shift, the kind of transformative impact in terms of the economic growth, in terms of the job creation, in terms of, frankly, the improvement of livelihoods that we need to see on the continent. So whether it's Gen Coal or other different options that are available to us, I think we have to model that in a way that the policies are aligned, the financing models are aligned, the kind of investments in terms of capital and the cost of that capital is aligned, because there's a number of these opportunities that are viable until the cost of capital is introduced, and then that advantage and that benefit is negated. So thinking through all these different levers, and those levers being able to provide an ability for us to assess in a very credible way what is it that we should be pursuing, and where there is no viability, what is it that we should be considering in terms of being able to improve on viability and the cost effectiveness of those solutions. And so I think this is part of the transition also in terms of Africa not just being seen as a destination for just philanthropic funds, where we can be seen as a true destination for the kind of scales of investments that we need to attract to advance our own growth and development.
It's a great answer there. We have another question from Oluwaseun Oluboyo. Given the development stage of the African continent and its relative share in global carbon emissions, should Africa pursue a net zero strategy like the global north? Who would like to, maybe you, Guillaume? I know you touched upon it earlier on.
Yeah, indeed. It's a sensitive topic, but indeed, that's clear that on average, an African emits 4 times less CO2 than an average habitant here. Having said all of that, I think we also mentioned the massive potential for solar, massive potential for hydro, for biomass, and also for gas. But we should tap in all of that. But I think the point I will make here is that I don't think there's a contradiction between targeting, increasing the share of renewable energy and the development. As we said before, relying on fossil fuels for power generation is extremely expensive for Africa. And shifting the usage of fossil fuels towards renewable energy is going to decrease the tariffs going forward, and hence is going to improve the access to electricity. I think we need to keep that in mind, and that's even more relevant, following the Ukraine crisis and then the huge increase of the energy cost, and it has impacted massively Africa. So in short, I don't think it's one against the other. We should really aim for access to electricity, and this access to electricity will come via promoting renewable energies, amongst other things.
Yes.
One thing just maybe to add on that, because I think I completely agree with that answer, but 14 countries in Africa have already set themselves net zero targets. And actually I think many of those countries have seen the benefits in terms of their engagements with multilateral donors to be able to attract the needed investments for electricity access, for clean cooking access, for renewable generation. So I think that we already see it. As you said, it is very much in the cards. The economics make sense. It is not an either or situation. The one key thing is when we think about the global journey to net zero and our ambitions there, we make it very clear with the IEA's net zero scenario, which reaches net zero by 2050. Advanced economies need to reach net zero much earlier than that. and then we see countries in Africa reaching it after 2050, and that we need to think about this in a global perspective. And I think this is something that you see in the new targets that are being set by Africa as well. So there is a differentiated responsibility that we need to keep in mind when talking about net zero.
And I think that's a great way to actually come to an end to this great, fascinating conversation, mentioning the countries that are already powering up. So before saying goodbye, au revoir, I would like to ask you individually your final recommendations in less than a minute. Daniel, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that so much of our conversation centered around this issue of bankability, and I think this is very clearly in the crosshairs of a lot of the development community, a lot of companies in Africa. How do we build up this pipeline? There's a lot of opportunity there, and I think this focus on productive uses, we've talked about mining, we've talked about new manufacturing. I think this is the new phase and focus areas. How do we make sure we're building demand at the same time as the supply versus the supply side only kind of question? So I think this is something that is the area to watch, and also the area to engage on when in discussions with financiers.
Thank you. And Guillaume, what are your final recommendations?
No, I think I leave a room with a sense of optimism, and overall, I think I'm quite an optimist about access to electricity in Africa. There are plenty of solutions that have emerged around, so let's not talk about that again. But I think one thing we need to add to all of that is the courage to implement them, the courage to lead things. It's not going to be an easy path. But I think with this courage on the top of all the solutions we talked about before, we will get there. Let's be optimistic.
Optimistic, courageous. Thank you very much. And Jack, we're going back to you for a final thoughts.
Right, just to echo, I think what GM and Daniel have highlighted. I think energy access is achievable, but I think we have to approach it differently. Just in the same way we have to step away from the traditional view of Africa just as a helpless victim of climate change. I believe that despite Africa carrying the biggest and the heaviest burden of climate change effects, limiting the continent's role to just say loss and damage, adaptation, resilience, does a huge disservice to our ability and the potential to play a crucial role in the planet's climate future. And we can approach energy access, we can approach decarbonization as an opportunity to drive economic growth. Then we will not only achieve universal access, but also position Africa towards its strength, which can translate into huge and major segments of economic opportunity.
So it is indeed possible. Thank you very much, Jack. Well, Daniel, Guillaume, thank you very much. And Jack, all the way from Nairobi, for being with us today and sharing your expertise, your insight. It was fascinating. I have to say that your contributions today really are helping us, getting a deeper understanding of the issues at heart on the table, and also showing us how Africa can really raise global expectations in the future and in terms of its energy ambitions. And to you, our audience, I really appreciate all your contributions today. Your questions were great. They were really thought-provoking as well. They helped us move the discussion along. Your engagement was indeed vital. And I want to leave you indeed with this invitation for our next webinar, which will take place on the 18th of October, in the run-up, in fact, of COP29, and which will introduce the concept of the two-track transition and how Africa must negotiate harder in global climate forums. So I really, really hope that you'll be able to tune in there. And it's been a pleasure to be your host today. And I want to leave you with this quote from Akinwumi Adesina, obviously the president of the African Development Bank. And he said, "No economy can grow in the dark. No economy can be competitive in the dark. Let's all try to power up Africa." Good day.